This is Unsung History, the podcast where we discuss people and events in American history that haven't always received a lot of attention. I'm your host, Kelly Therese Pollock. I'll start each episode with a brief introduction to the topic, and then talk to someone who knows a lot more than I do. Be sure to subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app so you never miss an episode. And please, tell your friends, family, neighbors, colleagues, maybe even strangers to listen to. On today's episode, we're discussing Korean immigrant and writer Mary Paik Lee. Mary Paik Lee, then called Paik Kuang Sun, was born in the Korean Empire on August 17th, 1900. She and her older brother, Mung, were both baptized by American Presbyterian minister Dr. Samuel Austin Moffett, one of the first Presbyterian missionaries to come to Korea. In 1904, Japan and Russia went to war over Manchuria and Korea. Japan had offered to recognize Russian dominance in Manchuria in exchange for their recognition of Japanese dominance in Korea, but Russia refused. Surprising the world, Japan won the war by 1905. During the war, the Japanese military had occupied Korea, and following the war, with Japanese troops surrounding the Korean Imperial Palace and stationed throughout the Korean Peninsula, former Japanese Prime Minister Ito Hiyobumi arrived in Korea and forced the Korean cabinet to sign a treaty, making Korea into a protectorate of Japan and stripping Korea of its sovereignty. 5 years later, in 1910, Japan would annex Korea, which remained a Japanese colony until 1945. In the midst of the Russo-Japanese War, early in 1905, Japanese soldiers came to Mary's house, telling the family they had to move out so that their home could be used to house Japanese troops. Mary's family fled by foot from Pyongyang, which is now the capital of North Korea, to Incheon Harbor, over 100 miles away. In Incheon Harbor, Mary's dad signed a contract with a sugarcane plantation that promised that in exchange for his agreement to work for them for a year, he and his family would receive free passage to Hawaii. On May 8, 1905, Mary and her parents and brother arrived in Hawaii aboard the SS Siberia. After the year was up, Mary's family moved to Riverside, California. Mary's dad had heard from friends there that prospects were better in America. Hawaii at the time was a territory, but not yet a state. Upon landing in San Francisco and disembarking from the SS China, Mary's family immediately faced harassment, as a group of white men laughed at them, spat in their faces, and called them names. In Riverside, the family lived in a one-room shack, and Mary's mom cooked breakfast and dinner and packed lunches for 30 single men who worked in the citrus groves. On Saturdays, Mary and her brother went to a slaughterhouse to scavenge for the animal organs that butchers discarded, scrambling with the Mexican children while the butchers laughed at them. The family stayed in Riverside for 4 or 5 years, and the children started school there. But it was a tough life, especially for Mary's mom. And when she was expecting her 5th child, the family moved to Claremont, where another family friend lived, in search, again, of something better. It was just the first of many moves in California for the family, constantly in search of somewhere where they could make enough money to get by. But everywhere they went, they faced discrimination and crushing poverty, despite their eagerness to work any jobs they could find. By age 11, when they were living in Colusa, California, Mary was working as a house cleaner to help out the family with her $1 a week wage. It was the first of many jobs she would work. As they moved, Mary's dad worked any jobs he could find, from janitor to potato farmer to mercury miner. Working in the mercury mine was so detrimental to his health that he eventually had to give it up and switch to another job at lower pay. Instead of going to high school, Mung had to quit school after 8th grade and work full-time to support the ever-growing family. Mary did leave home to attend high school in Hollister, California. There were no high schools where they had been living in India. Mary had to support herself through school, doing house cleaning and yard work and cooking in exchange for lodging. After a year, Mary was able to rejoin her family when they moved to Willows, a town that included a high school. In Willows, Mary met H.M. Lee, who had also left Korea in 1905, but who had gone from there to Mexico instead of Hawaii. Mary and H.M. were married at the American Presbyterian Church on January 1st, 1919. Despite continuing discrimination and health problems, H.M. and Mary were usually able to make a decent living, running a fruit and vegetable stand and farming. And they helped support Mary's family whenever they could. The couple raised 3 sons in California and eventually settled in Los Angeles. Their oldest son, Henry, earned his Ph.D. from the University of Pennsylvania and worked for the Federal Reserve Bank, the State Department, and the Treasury Department. Their middle son, Alan, worked in real estate. Their youngest son, Tony, faced several health challenges, including post-polio syndrome, which weakened his spine. H.M. died on June 29, 1975, in Los Angeles, after which Mary moved to San Francisco, where she volunteered as an interpreter at a Korean senior center for a decade. In 1986, Alan asked Dr. Su-Cheng Chan, who was teaching at the University of California, Santa Cruz at the time, if she would like to meet Mary, who had recently completed her memoir. Dr. Chan interviewed Mary and realized what an important story it was, a rare life history of an Asian American woman, and one that covers much of the 20th century. Dr. Chan edited the text and framed it with contextual essays, publishing it in 1990. Mary died in 1995 at the age of 95. Joining me to help us learn more about Mary Paik Lee is Dr. Jane Hong, Associate Professor of United States History at Occidental College, and the author of Opening the Gates to Asia, a Transpacific History of How America Repealed Asian Exclusion, and of an upcoming book chapter on Mary Paik Lee. Hi, Jane. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I am really excited to talk about Mary Paik Lee, who admittedly, it's another one of these that I had not heard of before, but I'm so thrilled to have learned about her. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about how you got to know about Mary Paik Lee's story. What drew you to her?
Yeah, so I learned about Mary Paik Lee in an undergraduate Asian American history class. I think it was my sophomore or junior year of college. You know, a new faculty member had arrived who taught this Asian American history class, and she assigned Mary Paik Lee's autobiography, Quiet Odyssey. And reading this, I mean, it was one of the first autobiographies written by an Asian American woman in English. And the book had been published in the 90s. And, I was in college in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so she had just passed away a few years before we were reading the book. And, I'm the child of Korean immigrants. My parents came to the US from South Korea in 1975 under the 65 Immigration Act. So that class in general was like a revelation to me because I really hadn't ever seen my own family's history reflected in anything I learned during high school and even through most of college. So that class was a revelation. And that book in particular, it was striking because it was the first time I had learned about Koreans living in the US before the 1960s. So before the wave that included my parents. And the other thing I was really struck by is, Mary Paik Lee, she was female and she was a child when she immigrated. And she also, her life really reflected the centrality of religion and specifically Protestant Christianity. And, I had grown up in a Korean immigrant church. Lots of folks in my generation had also grown up in Korean immigrant churches. And so I think that book really showed the importance of Christianity in shaping Korean immigration to the US historically, but also Korean Americans' experiences once they were in the US.
I've read a lot of autobiographies, and it's a little bit of a different structure than you might see in other autobiographies because it's not just, she didn't just go find a publisher and get it published, but it's actually bookended by this introduction by a historian and then a follow-up by like the historian saying, well, here's what I was able to find or not find to sort of corroborate her story, and here's sources you could look for more information. Could you talk just a little bit about that? It's such a sort of unique piece because of that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, so Su-Cheng Chan, I believe, was a historian who wrote kind of the framing essays and the forward, and as you noted, the epilogue. I think having a historian kind of contextualize Mary Paik Lee's life was really valuable because I think most folks, even folks who studied Asian American history at that time, so in the 90s when it was published, this book was published, there really wasn't much known about that very early period of Korean kind of American immigration. Mary Paik Lee, she's born in 1900, I think, as you mentioned, and she dies in 1995. So her life really spans almost the entirety of the 20th century. And she comes to the US at age 5. So she literally spends 90 years in the United States. And she lives through some of the most kind of formative periods, when I'm a 20th century US historian. So, I mean, she lives through wars, World War I, II, Korean War, Vietnam. She lives through the New Deal. I mean, she lives through kind of big milestones. And so having a historian who can kind of contextualize and help the reader understand, I think is really useful. I also thought, the framing pieces that Su-Cheng Chan contributed were useful because, women there really just aren't as many women migrating, Asian women migrating to the United States before the 1960s. And a lot of that has to do with exclusion laws. And I think folks might be more familiar with Chinese exclusion. And, I think after the Atlanta shootings in 2021, some folks might have heard of the Page Law of 1875 for the first time. The Page Law was really gendered. I mean, that law specifically targeted Chinese women and tried to bar them from entry on the assumption that they were coming for, quote, lewd and immoral purposes. So the assumption was, all Chinese women being brought in were being brought in for prostitution or being trafficked. And I think folks might also know that after the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, I mean, Chinese migrants, are heavily restricted, but, it's a highly gendered migration there as well, because most folks are coming in for labor purposes, folks coming to work on the railroads, So folks coming in the gold rush, folks coming to work on the railroads, and later, and folks coming in, I mean, these are majority men, and folks might have heard of the kind of bachelor communities of Chinatowns and the ways that Chinese men in the late 19th and 20th centuries were feminized, and kind of a lot of them worked in laundry and kind of traditionally feminine or feminized industries. And so there aren't that many women. And I think that's true for most Asian migrant groups. The one exception is Japanese immigrants. So a number of picture brides come in. And so those numbers are a little more balanced. But for most Asian immigrant groups, women are just not, there aren't as many of them. And so I think having the voice of someone like Mary Paik Lee was really valuable. And Su-Cheng Chan does specialize in women's history. So I think her perspective was really valuable. The last thing I'll say is, I also think it's hard to kind of even know where to begin with looking into, people like Mary Paik Lee. She actually has some papers at USC. She has a series of oral histories, which again, because she lives into the 1990s, there are actually recordings of her. And so these are incredibly valuable, but I think, it's wonderful having, a book like this, and then a kind of ready-made list of places you could look to find out more.
Yeah, it's funny. When I first started this podcast, I used to joke that I wanted to sort of get to real history, get to the stuff that's not covered, and I was like, I want to know what people ate for lunch in Kansas in 1920. And she's not in Kansas; she's in California. But like, whoa, do you get daily life in this? It's really incredible. Let's talk a little bit about the circumstances in Korea at the time that she left, and the reasons that her family go on this journey, first to Hawaii and then to California, to make what is a really hard living in both Hawaii and California. So what is going on in Korea at the end of the 19th, early 20th century?
Yeah, I mean, the really big piece of Mary Paik Lee's story, and she really starts with this in chapter 1, is Japanese colonization is beginning. So the Japanese are beginning to encroach on the Korean Peninsula. This is a longer story and longer history, but it really kind of Japanese encroachment ramps up in the early 1900s. And so, Mary starts, or she really starts her story by talking about the appearance of these Japanese soldiers at her front door, at her house in what is now, Pyongyang, the northern part of the Korean Peninsula. Now it's North Korea, but at the time it was just the northern part of Korea. And the soldiers demanded that her family leave. And this was a very common thing happening in the early 1900s as the Japanese were growing in terms of kind of their economic control over the peninsula, military. And I mean, over the course of the following years, I mean, by 1907, 1908, Japan has taken Korea as a protectorate, and by 1910, they formally annex it. And Korea stays under Japanese colonial rule until 1945, the end of World War II. And that whole story really, it centrally shapes Korean migration to the US, because for Lee's family, I mean, it displaces them, along with many other Koreans. It displaces families from their hometowns, and for I think it's about 7,200 Koreans migrate to the United States. So in particular, Hawaii, between 1903 and 1905. And what's really interesting is that many of these folks are actually already Christians. They identify as Protestant Christian before leaving, and many of them are recruited by missionaries. So U.S. missionaries, Horace Allen is one Presbyterian missionary who becomes a liaison between Hawaii sugar planters who are looking for other Asian labor to replace the Chinese who were now excluded under U.S. exclusion laws. And so Hawaii sugar planters are looking to, the Philippines, they're looking to other parts of Asia. And so Horace Allen kind of enters this conversation and creates an agreement, forges an agreement between Hawaii sugar planters and the Korean king Kojong, who up until that point had not really been as enthusiastic about emigration, right, letting Koreans leave. And so it's really through the direct efforts of U.S., particularly Presbyterian missionaries, that these Koreans came to the United States. And so there's a really interesting mix, or this interesting entanglement between U.S. capitalism, Christianity, and kind of the growth of what historians would call, right, U.S. empire during this period. And so Mary and her family are caught up in that. The last thing I'll say here is that Mary, again, she's quite unusual because even among the 7,200 Koreans, only about 600 are women and like 400 or something are children. So she's really, and she is a, child and a girl. So she's really unusual because she comes with her parents and with her brother. So she comes as part of a nuclear family, which was not the case for a lot of folks coming. And folks stopped coming from Korea in 1905 because the Japanese essentially stop the flow of Koreans leaving the peninsula, because by that time they had the ability to do that, even though they didn't formally annex Korea until a few years later.
Yeah, and I hadn't realized, I think, until reading this, that there were Koreans who were immigrating to Hawaii. I knew a lot about Japanese immigration to Hawaii, but not so much about Koreans. And so that was sort of a really fascinating piece. And it's interesting that they were, sort of specially targeting Koreans to recruit them to come to Hawaii. But Mary's family doesn't stay in Hawaii very long. They go then to California, and they go to California sort of without a plan. They just sort of get there and go, okay, now what? And that's sort of the story of Mary's family, right? Is they just keep going sort of from place to place and trying to figure out, how can we make a living here? What can we do to survive, to support the family? So is this story, do you think, sort of representative of not all immigrants to the U.S., but of Korean immigrants to the U.S. at this time? Is that the kind of life, as you mentioned, Mary's a little bit odd because she's a girl and she's a child, but this sort of what the families are going through?
Yeah, I would say so, because there really aren't that many Koreans entering. So this 7,000 plus group of Korean migrants, they're some of the only Koreans living on U.S. soil before the 1960s. And a lot of the folks, a lot of the pre-1965 Korean community descends from these folks. There are some more elite Korean figures who are able to come to the U.S. And this is a general trend. I do U.S. immigration, and under Asian exclusion laws, so Chinese exclusion gradually gets expanded to apply to other Asian groups. So Chinese are targeted first, then it's Japanese, then it's Indians, and later it's Filipinos. By 1924 and 1934, basically all Asians are barred from long-term immigration. Koreans are kind of thrown in the mix because there aren't that many of them. But eventually, after Korea comes under Japanese colonial rule, for the purposes of U.S. immigration law, Koreans are effectively Japanese, so they're also restricted under those policies. So, I think that, for the small group of Koreans, a lot of them do end up, so some stay in Hawaii, and there's a thriving, there is an ongoing Korean community that continues, right? Even folks now who live in Hawaii, there is a group of folks who can trace their lineage directly back to this first migration wave. And they did celebrate the centennial, right, in 2003. So I remember seeing pictures and kind of volumes from that celebration. But you're right, many Koreans do come to the mainland through California. And yeah, most of these folks, they're just picking up whatever jobs they can because, the first half of the 20th century in particular, anti-Asian racism, it's pretty virulent. People might be familiar with the anti-Chinese movement of the late 1800s into the 1900s. Obviously, a lot of this violence continues. And, folks who are targeting Chinese later, some folks target Japanese, the Indians, right, the quote, tide of turbans that folks talk about. As I mentioned before, right, these exclusion laws, Congress broadens exclusion to bar all Asians. And it's in response to exclusionists on the ground, right? So organized labor initially, and then, agricultural interests, white workers. There's various groups that really mobilize to get first Sacramento and then Washington, D.C. on board in terms of excluding Asians. Koreans, people don't really know what that is, right? In there, like people literally don't know what Korea is. And, Mary tells these stories of going to school in various parts of California. I think her family, as you mentioned, they move around a lot. They settle in places like Riverside, which is one of the first kind of Korean settlements in the U.S., Pachapa Camp. There's actually a book that recently came out about that group. So Riverside, they live in, different cities across Central California. They really just move around, wherever her dad can get a job. So he works in the fields, he works in factories, and oftentimes, he works in these jobs that take a huge toll on his health. So by the time, right, he's even just in his 40s or 50s, he's already like pretty worn down and in pretty bad health because of kind of working conditions in different places. I believe he worked in like a glass factory. There's all kinds of hazards associated with those kinds of jobs, but they were really at subsistence level or sometimes not even at subsistence level. And so there's literally an entire section of the book where Mary talks about just like the hunger that she experienced as a child and just the kind of experience of poverty. And what's interesting is that throughout those discussions, like the fact that she is Christian, so there's two themes that I think run through the book. The first is her Christian faith. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the second, which is Koreans at that time, with a lot of them share in common, regardless of class or educational background, they're all fighting for Korean independence. And so a lot of early Korean American history is really focused on kind of Koreans in the US as a diaspora that's extremely kind of committed to collecting money, sending funds, doing all that it can to support Koreans who are trying to liberate the peninsula from Japanese colonial rule. And that literally lasts throughout the entire Japanese colonial period. And I've written about this in my own work. And Korean churches here in places like California, Hawaii, and across the US, they become some of the central kind of organizing sites where folks gather together. They're praying not just for, their families and for salvation and all the things that folks are associated with Protestant Christianity, but they're praying for the liberation of their homeland. And that's it's kind of like a guide. It's like a North Star for many of these early Korean migrants. And for Mary too, even though she's really young, she still had lots of family in Korea. And there are stories and reports that US missionaries are sending back to the US of persecution, right, and of the atrocities committed by Japanese colonial officials in Korea during this period. And so like these things are all tied together very much. And you can see them. I think what's really valuable about the book is you see kind of these broader kind of, transnational geopolitical, right, kind of movements through the eyes of like a young Korean girl living in California who's also just trying to eat, go to school, find a church and not, she's dealing with like everyday racism. And she talks about those experiences too, of going to, there weren't that many Korean churches, even in California at that point, only in places where Koreans lived, where there are Korean churches. So often she would find herself at white churches, even Presbyterian churches. And, she had some really, very kind of traumatic experiences in these white church Christian spaces that I think really she remembers these because, they were Christian communities. And so that's another kind of piece of the book that I find really interesting and that I think I've thought a lot about. It's just kind of what does racism look like, anti-Asian racism look like, but then what does it look like among Christian communities in particular?
I want to come back to the discrimination and racism in a minute, but I'd like to sort of understand a little bit more about the centrality of Christianity to Koreans and Korean Americans. I think this is something that, at least to my sort of superficial understanding, seems to distinguish Korean Americans from maybe Japanese Americans or Chinese Americans. So what is it about either Christianity and its relationship to Korea or the people who come from Korea that makes Christianity just a little more of a sort of central feature for this group of immigrants?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, U.S. missionaries, particularly Presbyterian missionaries, but also Methodist missionaries, they were some of the main recruiters of Korean migrants to the U.S. during this period. So something like 40% or more of these early Korean migrants identified as Protestant Christian. Many of them had direct ties to Presbyterian missionaries like Horace Allen, as I mentioned earlier. Samuel Moffett was the one that Mary Paik Lee's family was connected to. Although, to be clear, Samuel Moffett was a little more ambivalent about Koreans leaving for the U.S. So not all missionaries were on board, but I think the prominent role that missionaries played in this labor migration is really pivotal to this kind of early migration. And then, I think generally, even with people like Syngman Rhee, so Syngman Rhee is a Korean migrant. He later becomes the first president of the Republic of Korea, South Korea, under U.S. In partnership with the U.S. after World War II. Syngman Rhee, probably the most prominent Korean to come to the U.S. He comes through missionary and religious connections as well. So lots of folks, even elite folks, who are not coming, as laborers, they're coming through Salvation Army. They're coming through kind of denominations, missions boards. And so there's that piece of it. And to be very frank, even later, so there's kind of a lull in Korean migration where you just have not many folks coming between really 1905 and the 1960s. There aren't that many folks. But when Korean immigration picks up again after the 1965 Immigration Act, a very high percentage of those folks also identify as Protestant Christian or later become Protestant once they are in the United States. And that's a really, so it's not just a historical phenomenon. I think it continues to shape Korean American experiences today. I think something like a few years ago, Pew did a study, and something like 70% of Korean Americans identified as Protestant, and a majority actually are Presbyterian, so PCUSA or PCA, I guess by today's standards. And a lot of those folks have actually, they're second wave Christians, so they had actually been exposed oftentimes to U.S. evangelicalism before migrating to the U.S. So, my uncle's an example. He became Christian through Campus Crusade for Christ Korea in the 1970s and then migrated to the U.S. To join my parents in the 80s. So I think that kind of experience is not actually uncommon.
As you've mentioned, Mary and her family faced all sorts of discrimination, and it's both this sort of structural discrimination and racism in the laws that were put in place, but it's also, as you said, this sort of everyday thing that they're just facing sort of everywhere they go, everything they try to do. So I want to talk about that some, and then maybe connect that to really ways that it's still happening. So I think maybe one of the most sort of striking times in her life that this happens is around World War II. Because, as you mentioned, people are sort of seeing Koreans and just thinking, oh, they're Japanese, and so she's facing this racism. What are the things that sort of stand out in her story to you about this discrimination that she's facing sort of everywhere she goes?
Yeah, World War II is a really interesting moment. And Mary Paik Lee tells this story about how right after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, she remembers going into a local store owned by former President Richard Nixon's mom. I guess they're part of the same kind of general community in Southern California. And the Nixons, of course, were Quaker. And so so Nixon's mother, who he's often described as like the most lovely woman, gentle and all these things. So Mary Paik Lee's in the store. She's an adult by this time with her own children. She had left her son in the car to wait for her. Her son was very young at that time. And so when she was in the store, just going about her business, she had been in the fields all day because I think she and her husband, eventually they become farmers and they sell produce, and that's how they make their living. But she begins to hear some people they're talking about it. They're talking about Pearl Harbor, and there's this kind of growing sense of hostility. And she feels it in the store. She doesn't know what's going on initially. One person actually starts verbally kind of attacking her. And Richard Nixon's mother, who's manning the counter, who owns the store, kind of steps in and defends and just says, of course you know, Mary, she's been shopping here for years. How could you claim to not know her? And then Mary leaves the store. She goes back to her car where she's left her son, which again, you could do in the 1940s, and you can't do that today. And she finds this young group of boys at the window taunting her son and kind of threatening to attack him. I think he's like 2 or something at this point, or 3. He's very young. And so she hurriedly gets out of there. She yells at the young boys, and then gets out of there. But I think, her experience is really interesting because she's not ethnically Japanese. And so her experience underscores how anyone who can even vaguely be kind of seen as Japanese. Like, so Chinese folks, Chinese Americans at the time, Korean Americans, even Filipino Americans. There are reports of folks being beaten, harassed. Mary tells a story of there's a couple in her community, a Korean couple, they're driving down the street and they're stopped. And then the husband is dragged out of the car and beaten, because folks think he looks Japanese. And so I think, again, that kind of blanketed, anti-Asian discrimination that doesn't really distinguish between ethnically Japanese folks and other folks. I mean, that's one parallel you can see to, I think, many kind of episodes of anti-Asian racism in the United States. It's like, maybe during the anti-Chinese movement, the Chinese were targeted. Maybe during World War II, Japanese were targeted. Obviously, they were incarcerated. But other folks who looked vaguely Asian were still targeted even after Japanese Americans were literally in camps for all of World War II. And you can see this kind of pattern, into more contemporary histories, obviously even today. One of the first incidents I can remember being reported at the beginning of the pandemic, kind of early 2020, kind of March, I believe, was like a Burmese family shopping at a South Texas, I think it was a Sam's Club. It was a Burmese family that was targeted. I think the father had his face slashed and then his son had his face slashed with a razor by a fellow customer. So it's people don't really distinguish, right, when it comes to this kind of racism. And I think that's kind of another commonality or theme, right, that I see from Mary's period that in many ways, it still rings true in the present.
Yeah, it seems particularly upsetting for Mary, who doesn't really like the Japanese that much, at least, toward the beginning. I think as she went through her life, that maybe changed. But, as you said, they were occupying her country. To be confused with Japanese is particularly galling, I think, for her. But either way, she's facing discrimination, which, makes her life harder.
Yeah, and that's something that I've seen like scholars kind of tackle. Like, what does it mean once you have, Chinese, Koreans, Filipinos, Japanese living in the United States? Like, what difference does it make that they're not in Asia anymore? Like, and how does Japanese imperialism and Japanese oppression of many groups in Asia, how does that kind of translate into interethnic relations in the United States? And I think there are a number of historians who have done work on that. Mary's interesting because this also kind of suggests some difference of kind of generational mindsets, because, she is a young child when she comes. She is deeply embedded in the Korean independence movement, and anti-Japanese sentiment, as you mentioned, is like deeply built into, honestly, a lot of Korean conversation and kind of Korean newspapers around this time, right? They're heavily anti-Japanese for many reasons, obviously. But it's interesting because in her book, she does talk about that. She also talks about how, she's a farmer and her next door neighbors, some of them they're Japanese Americans who are also farmers. And so I think she also does this probably in part because she's writing in the 1980s, 1990s from a distance of many decades. But she talks about how, during the war, she actually she moves into a farm owned by a Japanese American couple friend. When they were incarcerated, Mary's family promised to kind of watch over their farms and to make sure they didn't lose everything. And so there are those kind of moments where you see, right, how once folks are in the United States, there is some distance, and Japanese Americans are not necessarily always held to account for what Japanese people are doing. So at least, even if other folks don't necessarily distinguish between Japanese and Japanese Americans, like the War Relocation Authority, like that at least people on the ground, like Mary, could understand to some extent the difference between Japanese Americans in the US and Japanese in Asia.
So we've said this discrimination and racism, sadly, is still going on and is actually, according to reports, picking up in this country. I think, one of the things that strikes me is how little education in Asian American history students get. You said you didn't get it till sort of later in college.
this is certainly not something that I learned very much. And my own kids who are in elementary school now, they're getting increasing exposure to Native American history and Black American history, but really not as much to Asian American history. So I wonder if you could just sort of reflect on how we could do better on that front, and in ways to, that alone won't stop discrimination and racism, but it can't hurt.
So I've already seen some moves toward things that could be productive in terms of at least helping people understand what's happening and hopefully reducing the likelihood of further violence going forward. I think states like California and then Illinois and then most recently New Jersey have passed ethnic studies requirements. And in particular in Illinois and New Jersey, those legislatures passed resolutions or passed bills requiring that AAPI or Asian American histories be taught in the classroom, in the K-12 classrooms. And I've been doing some work with, I'm doing like a session on Monday, actually, with some teachers in New Jersey, because they're looking to implement those units in the following, I think, in the next 2 academic years. I do think, I'm a historian, so what else can I think but to believe that if folks understand that what's happening now is actually connected to a much longer history where Asians have been targeted and racialized by not just by like random individuals, like the person in Sam's Club, but that this history, that kind of this violence ties to a much longer history of structural racism and particularly legal, like legal structures, racialized exclusion laws that have effectively racialized Asians as foreign, as like un-American, unassimilable on the one hand, and then kind of model minorities on the other hand, model minorities who might not need any help, whose lives are actually, they're not actually targets of racism, because clearly if they've been successful, then, clearly racism is not necessarily a problem for them. So there's been this dual racialization of Asian Americans through this longer history of structural racism. And I think I have to believe that if folks, learn some of that history, there's a greater understanding of how Asian Americans are actually people of color that have a lot in common with other people of color. In terms of other things, raising awareness in general is really important. I myself am still thinking through like what are concrete kind of solutions. I think carceral options, right? Talk about greater kind of law enforcement, stronger hate crimes laws can become problematic. So I think myself and many other kind of scholars who do this kind of work are kind of thinking through like what are ways to do this kind of work, to raise this awareness and to raise understanding without always resorting to greater militarization, which has creates all kinds of other problems.
Is there anything else before we wrap up that you would like to make sure we talk about Mary?
So I recently wrote a chapter about Mary for a book that's coming out this year with Erdman's Press. It's looking at just 12 Americans of faith who have engaged different struggles in their lifetimes. And in the process of writing that chapter, I was actually in contact with some of her descendants, her nephew, her children. And I think I was just struck by the fact that, this is very much living history. Like people are literally, Mary herself might have passed on in 1995, but her descendants are very much, her children are very much still alive. And the other thing is, and I write about this in the chapter, I think Mary Paik Lee, some folks reading her autobiography have kind of framed her book as another version of a model minority story, because she does go from, abject poverty in the early 1900s to a place by the 1980s where like one of her sons, works for the World Bank, right? So she has successful children. Her grandchildren are much more integrated and they go to good schools. But she's really interesting because she spends significant time, and her last chapter is actually talking about one of her sons who has all kinds of physical maladies that have really kind of restricted what he could, quote, accomplish in his life. And she very much, I don't know if she does this intentionally, but she kind of intentionally writes against a kind of model minority kind of trajectory. She talks about her son, Tony, and how proud she is of him and how much he's accomplished, like, quote, accomplished despite all of his maladies. And and she's not talking about his accomplishments in terms of where he went to school or like what kind of fancy job or how much money he makes, but just his perseverance and his persistence and his resilience over time. And I think that is I found that just very humanizing. I found that very refreshing too. And I think it really, she's writing against the grain of this kind of model minority trajectory, which, I mean, folks who do Asian American history, I feel like most of our lives are just spent writing against the model minority trajectory. Because what that does is the model minority myth, it really kind of dehumanizes Asian Americans by flattening all of them and weaponizing them against Black communities. And so folks like Mary, I think, are able to bring the humanity back in and to really kind of redefine like what matters and what values matter, especially for someone, who's a person of faith.
So I will put in the show notes a link for people to be able to get Mary's book, which they should definitely do. But I would also like to encourage them to look at your work as well. Can you talk about how people can find your work?
So I'm on Twitter, like many academics. You can find me at Jane Hong, PhD, where I tweet a lot about just various things. I'm writing a book about Asian American evangelicals, and so I've been thinking a lot about race and faith, particularly race and evangelical politics, since the 1970s. And you can also find me just on the web. My personal website's janehongphd.com. And I would love to hear from folks and engage further.
All right. Excellent. Well, Jane, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I loved learning about Mary's life and learning, frankly, this whole sort of chapter of history that I just didn't know that much about.
Thanks so much for having me. This was really fun.
Thanks for listening to Unsung History. You can find the sources used for this episode at unsunghistorypodcast.com. To the best of our knowledge, all audio and images used by Unsung History are in the public domain or are used with permission. You can find us on Twitter or Instagram at unsung__history or on Facebook at Unsung History Podcast. To contact us with questions or episode suggestions, please email Kelly at unsunghistorypodcast.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate and review and tell your friends.
MSW Media.